Okay, we're back. Marie, all yours.
Okay. So I should start by saying that here at CJJ, we're incredibly excited by the release of this report and view it as fuel for the fire that we already have in our bellies to spur change in juvenile justice. And I would also mention that all four of the recommendations are very much consistent with CJJ's aspirations for the field. But as Betty mentioned, we're going to hone in on recommendation number 1, which we think has particular salience for the field and for SAG specifically. So the question that I would pose to either one of you is this. So the recommendation calls for the convening of multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary bodies under the auspice of the governor, and that body would chart a course for juvenile justice reform in the state. If I were a member of a SAG or a SAG chair looking at this report, it might occur to me that what you described sounds very much like a SAG. So in your view, what's the distinction between the body that you call for in this recommendation and SAGs as they exist today? And either one of you can jump in.
Well, I think this is going to be mine. I think the most important distinction between what we were envisioning as a structure for promoting juvenile justice reform and the SAGs, as I understand the statutory composition and mandate that they have, is fundamentally the issue of mandate. Based on the literature about achieving transformative reform in different areas, the committee took the view that a common theme in these situations is that there is political commitment by one of the leading branches of state government, and that is really a necessary element for this kind of transformative reform. And it could be the governor, it could be a legislative body, it could be the Supreme Court. And in the area that we're talking about now, I mean, given the kind of the multi-branch, interagency aspect of it, you could imagine that this could come from any direction. But the key is that there is initially going to be, political leadership. And if that leadership is there and there's that kind of commitment, our finding also is that what seems to have worked best, and this has happened, of course, in the juvenile justice reform area as well, having consensus-building, multi-stakeholder groups to hammer out consensus among themselves in essentially bipartisan structure, having been given the mandate to do that, and then using that product then as the basis for moving forward with whatever action is required, which is often, of course, going to be legislative action, has had a promising, period of success, and particularly in situations that may be confronting now, where there seems to be a considerable momentum for reform based on the kind of developmental knowledge that has been summarized in this report and the experience of many states that have been in the vanguard of these efforts for 10 or 15 years. And so we were really speaking to the generative effort to kind of get reform going. So I think the key question here is one of mandate. It is possible that SAGs could be given that kind of mandate. It raises lots of questions in terms of the statutory authority, for the SAG and so on. Another angle that I want to mention also is I've been mentioning here kind of the generative effort to actually develop a program or a vision, of reform and basically, take the initial steps that need to be taken to kind of put it in place, which could involve interagency, reorganizations, the transfer of authority from one, agency or department to another. It could, involve, decisions about institutions and so on, as well as some of the principles that we've talked about here. But beyond the initial steps, there's an extremely important challenge in sustaining the reforms that have actually been undertaken. And so we have to understand that reform of this kind and in other areas is not process. It has to unfold over time. The changes have to be monitored over time so that there's not backsliding and that there's, a sense of continued momentum and commitment that has to occur. So there has to be also a political commitment to reform as an irreversible process. And then you need another entity, which again, it could be within the legislature in terms of a standing committee. It could be an executive body, and it also could be an entity that has been, established under the auspices of the courts. Again, highly contextual. It depends upon, the leadership in the particular state. But the importance there is that you have to have a data structure and the tool for continuing to monitor what is going on. Now, it seems like in this area there's another possibility in terms of ways in which the SAG could take on that responsibility, assuming that there was an appropriate political support for doing it that way. So I think those would be my thoughts about that.
Okay, and you anticipated my next question, which would have been whether or not the role of the SAG might appropriately be the monitoring body that you just referred to.
Yeah, it certainly could be. I think, again, you have to have the right composition, and you also have to have the right funding. Obviously, there would have to be considerable staff support, to implement this. This converges with other recommendations that we made in the report, too. Whoever is responsible for it, an absolutely essential ingredient for evidence-based reforms of the kinds that we have in mind and for transforming the system in the desired way, including, of course, DMC and the issues around that, is to have adequate data to be able to carry out this function. And you need a data infrastructure, a commitment to it, and then the appropriate expertise to continue to monitor it, issue periodic reports. It has to be a transparent process. So if the SAG, were to be serving that function, again, there would have to be some considerable thought about whether that's the kind of mandate that you want to have conferred on the SAG.
Okay. So many SAGs and other juvenile justice actors in the states have recognized the need that you identify with this recommendation, and they've become engaged with initiatives like the NEKC Foundation's Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative, Models for Change from the MacArthur Foundation, and both of those initiatives contemplate the forming of bodies that sound very similar to what you're describing in this recommendation. So how does that interplay work? If we have folks out in the states that are already JDAI sites or JDAI states, how does that interact with what you're
Well, again, it's, to sort of reiterate what Richard said, it depends upon what their mandate is and what the support for them are. Obviously, you don't want to duplicate a group that has the appropriate mandate and has the funding and that has been working on this. But generally, we're not just talking sort of a coordinating body or a convening body. We're talking about a body that really has the authority to do something. And in our report, we give examples of groups that have sort of come together who either were initially given this authority or given the authority after they accomplished what they had done. And so the experience of New York and the experience in Louisiana, the experience in Illinois, and as we understand, Indiana. But generally, it just can't be a matter of something that's really, and the foundation for this enormously helpful, and they have really been the ones to sort of move this along. But it's really the question of who has the authority.
Yeah, I would just add, to that again. I think that it's so important that there be a consensus in favor of whatever structure is put in place, so that there is a body that is regarded as authoritative, credible, and that where there is a commitment to take seriously the evidence that's being presented and continue the process. So there has to be, as I said at the beginning, an irreversible sort of commitment to continue this process. And at that point, obviously you want everyone to continue their advocacy and continue their efforts to produce evidence. But it seems like having a body that has been given the mandate to assimilate all the relevant evidence and then make appropriate conclusions, findings, and recommendations as to what should be done is the ideal way, to undertake this. But obviously, this has to be a body that's reviewed, that is regarded as authoritative and credible by all the stakeholders.
I just want to add one other thing. We use the word sluggish to describe sometimes the pace of reform, but even as we light your question, there are many states that have not reached even the level that would qualify or would be of interest, who are interested in JDAI as models for change. And so it seems to me that the SACs have a real role here to begin to generate the interest, to get folks to this sort of first level, and then really sort of move forward.
I had a couple of other questions, but I'm being told that we have limited time. So I'm going to move on to the one that I think many folks might be thinking about. So in the recommendation, you also talk about reducing disparities in the juvenile justice system. And I know that many of our states are completing their GMC assessments, and they want to start to think about how to implement change that those assessments call for. Is there anything in this report that would give them guidance on how to do that?
Let me say that we do have a detailed chapter in the report that sort of reviews what is, first of all, which may be helpful to many people, what really is new, where are we here in terms of what the research has to say about the extent of DMC, the impact of DMC, and I think it's very current, and I think it will be useful to people. This is something that we talk about, we describe as the elephant in the room. And we see the whole issue of DMC inextricably tied up, as Richard mentioned, with fairness. And as such, really deserves in keeping with the whole theme of our report and the message of our report, deserves really increased attention. We looked at various programs. We talked with JJDP. We tried to figure out what other people had said. And basically, we do identify 4 strategies, most of which your SAGs are going to be very, very familiar with, but I think maybe it bears repeating just very quickly. We do think that there needs to be continued attention to the arrest and detention stage, because once the youth are in the system, then we know that there can be a harsher treatment for minority youth as they proceed through, and that there really needs to look at where discretion is in the system. The second reform strategy we talk about is focusing really on the school practices. Some like to describe the feeders into the system, schools being one, the mental health system being another, and child welfare being the third. And recent reports, the Texas report showing the disproportionate number of minority kids who are being expelled, defendants expelled from school, and the amount of discretion. And while we're not always sure what the link is between that and their actual referral to the juvenile justice system, we think that deserves increased attention. We also think, there continues to be needs to be an emphasis on eliminating these policies or practices, either formal or informal, that really shows the disadvantage of minority youth. And we talk in the report about that sometimes there may be intentional bias, but maybe not. It doesn't really matter. The end result is the same. We also think the accountability of state and local governments in reducing DMC should be increased. And then we get into this whole monitoring function, the transparency of the DMC reporting. And I think this is really what I would say is, before we mentioned sort of the key, increasing accountability for this problem.
So big topic, small amount of time. Franklin, I don't know if you want to open up for questions, or are there folks with their hands raised? Okay, I think we'll let them.
If anyone has any questions, please go ahead and raise your hand as you've done before. Okay. Syl Robinson?
Yes. When you say that there should be accountability at the national, state, and local level, I agree with that. My concern, however, in light of recent cuts, is there going to be, if there is such a requirement, would there also be resources provided to be able to develop the infrastructure necessary?
So just a question for clarification. So the National Academy of Sciences is not imposing any requirements. They're making recommendations that will spur juvenile justice reform.
Right.
So to the extent that a state or locality should choose to implement any of these, there are other recommendations in the report that call for robust appropriations to support them.
Okay.
But just a little bit of clarification there.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we're free to move on.
Yeah, so, I mean, if there's time.
Sure, go ahead.
So I just wanted to pick up on the DMC theme and the role of the SAGs. I mean, obviously there's already an important responsibility that SAGs have in that connection. And for the reasons that we've already been talking about, the kind of ambitious role for a SAG that is going to be the basic architect of reform and a major body to oversee its implementation may not be realistic in many places, and obviously a lot of consideration would need to be undertaken to go into that. However, it did strike us that the DMC area for which there is already a responsibility might provide a foothold for a somewhat more ambitious role for SAGs that wanted to move the ball forward in connection with the kinds of developmental model that is emphasized in the report. And we've tried to emphasize, as I mentioned earlier, that the DMC issue is, in our judgment, embedded in a much larger issue about fairness in the juvenile justice system and perceptions of fairness, particularly among minority kids. We even emphasized in the very fundamental developmental literature that perceptions of discrimination and unfair treatment begin to take hold early on, in the development of young minority children and adolescents. And that becomes an issue that you then have to deal with on an ongoing basis. If they become involved in the juvenile justice system, or elsewhere. And so trying to have a broader view of the importance of promoting fairness and perceptions of fairness in the juvenile justice system, not only for the youth but their families and others who are involved, potentially even victims, of course, as well, it seems to us a very important element of the reform process going forward. And we did emphasize, if that's taken seriously, you need to look for performance measures and mechanisms of trying to monitor fairness and perceptions of fairness. And that might be an area, generally speaking, in conjunction with the general commitment to reducing DMC, that SAGs could actually carry out on their own initiative as part of system improvement, general system improvement issues, working across the entities with the courts and the juvenile justice agencies and families and advocacy groups. And there's a long agenda here. I mean, there's a scientific agenda, but there's also a kind of a practical agenda of actually getting this going forward. So if the SAGs are looking for an opportunity to kind of, have a proactive role in the kind of transformative reform that we're talking about here, that might be a useful one.
Okay. I want to be respectful of our experts' time. I think we're at about the hour. So for CJJ, I think what we would want folks to take away from this webinar is that, we just want to reinforce that we believe that SAGs are well positioned to support and promote system change, and we view this report as providing fuel for them to be able to do that. I think for many years, you all in the field have felt like you're beating your heads against a brick wall, and you don't have sort of a neutral, authoritative voice to support the positions that you've taken. We believe that this report gives you that. It's very dense. There's a lot of stuff there, but that's what CJJ is about. We're going to help you digest it, and of course, as often as we can, we'll give you access to experts like we have today, and to help you clarify and answer questions that you might have. So thank you for joining us, and just pointing out the very last slide that you'll see. You can download a copy of the report, and of course, CJJ is always here and available to answer any questions.